Choose division, not inclusion. Advent is the truth that prepares us to be set free. It's no longer fashionable to preach on the four last things during Advent. Death, judgment, hell, and heaven are not easy to digest for so many people who are immured in the Christmas shopping season. But this may be a pity, because we're in the middle of trying to subdue a vigorous secular heresy. It's made up of two elements that have their place in Christianity, but they've been twisted out of shape. Secular religiosity is marked by a veneration for two things: victimhood and the nice. Victimhood, once the key to interpreting the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, has been wrenched out of context, and it's been relayed into a political and psychological framework offering secular sanctification to those who appear to be victims of power relations. The nice involves the promise of stroking or protecting the delicate ego from wounds. Unaffected by awareness of selfishness or narcissism, it's become a moral absolute. Any threat to the stroking of the ego is rejected as not nice and is already serious secular sin. St. Thomas More, in his own profound treatise on the last four things, written in 1522, warns against the lure of the counterfeit, in particular counterfeit pleasure. But there are other counterfeits, in particular counterfeit values. Defending the pride and self-asserted virtue of the ego at all costs involves counterfeit values. So what antidote does Christmas bring to the self-delusion of our pampered and egotistical culture? It's not just the Freudian slip that unmasks the hidden motivations that drive us. Our use of language often unmasks our inner preferences. So no one dies nowadays, they only pass. There's no confrontation with the dead body, for the state will tidy that away for you. There are enormous efforts made to postpone death, but very few to face it, and even harder interpret it. Death is the greatest rebuke to our hubris and the self-delusion of our self-sufficiency. There are almost no lengths people will not go to in order to avoid facing what it tells us about our faux moral and physical independence. Judgment. Judgment has been neutered. The emergence of the ubiquitous "my truth" threatens to water down and dissolve any recognition of moral absolute. The prospect of being answerable at the end of our lives to the purest moral examination and amending our choices accordingly is fast disappearing. This is not a matter of just self-delusion or mass delusion. It's a serious threat to the existence of the recognition of the existence of moral virtue. If there are no universal values because there's nothing I am accountable to beyond my own delusory self-perceptions, then our sense of shared humanity suffers a grievous blow. And yet, there is a powerful universal longing for justice. Only the promise of the last judgment can fulfill this profound universal need, which may be one of the few things that can be appealed to in order to regain recognition of our shared humanity. The universal longing for justice may be the only antidote to the unsustainable solipsism we're drowning in, scared of offending people as the church so often is, in the same way that a doctor has the responsibility for telling the truth about facing a terminal disease. There is an element of having to risk being cruel to be kind. And yet it's not really a cruelty to warn people that each of us are accountable for the gift of freedom we've been given, and which all of us have misused. It's the only thing that confers a dignity in an otherwise moral state of near anarchy. Hell. Well, hell is strictly taboo. Worse than that, to warn people of the prospect of hell has become a hate crime, as too many brave and intrepid street evangelists have found to their cost. How is it possible that a good God could condemn any of his creatures to alienation permanently? Well, acres of philosophical ink have been spilt over this. The place I go to for the greatest comfort in the face of this predicament is the English mystic Julian of Norwich. She wrote in the late 15th century. In one of her showings, she confronts our Lord with the deeper question that underlies all the others. Lord, how could you have dared to take the risk of creating and offering free will in the foreknowledge it would go wrong and issue out in pain, suffering, and even for some, hell? Jesus responds enigmatically but hopefully. He promises an act on the last day which will, by a process of inversion, bring the greatest joy and glory from the most grievous sin, disaster, and rebellion. It can't be rationally explained this side of our mortality, but it requires trust. I think St. Paul touches on this when he asks the rhetorical question, shall we sin that grace may abound, in Romans 6? And yet those who remind us that hell is an imposition from our side more than God's side in judgment do so by helping us reflect that pride and impurity find forgiveness and purity a gross violation of rebellious personal autonomy. Nothing enrages impenitence more than the offer of forgiveness, which always implies there's a misdemeanor that needs confronting. Hell would appear to be a choice, but from our side. The promise of heaven, beyond the confines of the entropy of slowly dying time and space, is the rebuke to the illusory promise of peace in our time. There can be no possibility of peace and reconciliation between people if we take seriously the wound of original sin. Those who promise peace, justice, and parity on the political and social dimension do so only by pretending that human goodness is sufficient to overcome our flaws. They ignore the reality that the price paid for our human freedom is an addiction to perversity, disorder, and evil. Freedom of usually poorly judged choice gives birth to our self-imposed alienation from that which is most pure and most beautiful. C.S. Lewis was at his best when he reminded us that our aesthetic, intellectual, and romantic longing is rooted in the reality of God, and not in what we can create for ourselves. Sehnsucht, longing all that is beautiful and good, is an appetite that God has given us to keep us hungry for heaven and to show we're made in his image. Inclusivity is the deceptive mantra intended to keep us immune from the freedom Jesus was born to bring. Where freedom of choice has led us into blind alleys and self-spiritual harm, Jesus comes to separate darkness from light, evil from good, offence from justice, vengeance from forgiveness, those who want to remain lost from those who are desperate to be forgiven and found. It is in separation that our sight is restored. It is in vision that we are set free from false appetites of pleasure and counterfeit values. Advent is a time of promise and an antidote to despair. It is the time to contemplate the hard realities of our approaching deaths, the reality of judgment that reassures us there is justice at the heart of the universe, and the danger of choosing hell, and the happiness of heaven that the Incarnation makes possible and which is gifted to us. Without Advent there can be no true feast of the Incarnation, no Christmas. Only the truth can set us free.